In Ethiopia, 7 million people are threatened by starvation. Thousands have already died. The famine caused by drought is the worst in living memory, and now the rains have failed again for the third year in succession. Relief organizations are doing all they can, but there just isn't enough food to go around.
The Ethiopian famine of the mid-1980s was a catastrophic event that captured the world's attention. The images of suffering and starvation that came out of Ethiopia and across people's television screens were shocking and heart-wrenching. A prolonged drought combined with war and rebellions caused major disruptions to food supplies in northern Ethiopia.
More than 1 million people died, with millions more being displaced around the country as they sought food to keep themselves alive. Hundreds of thousands of children were orphaned, and brutal conditions left many devoid of hope. The images of starving Ethiopians generated an outpouring of global sympathy, and many organizations, including religious ones, leapt to offer assistance. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, guided by its principles of Christian charity, mobilized to help despite having no formal humanitarian resources at the time.
The Ethiopian famine of 1985 was a tragic event, but the wheels it set in motion have led to the worldwide network of humanitarian service we almost take for granted today, known as Latter-day Saint Charities.
This is Saints Volume 4, the podcast. I'm Lisa Christensen.
And I'm James Perry. The origins of Latter-day Saint Charities.
I wasn't a three-piece suit template kind of guy. I was more of a rough and tumble, get at it and get it done kind of person.
That's Ike Ferguson, former director of the church's Humanitarian Services Department. He was a member of the church but hadn't grown up in it, and sometimes felt out of place among what he viewed were more genteel members surrounding him.
I didn't have a lot of insight, and I certainly didn't have any example in my home or family on how to behave in a church setting. So in many cases, I was kind of like a bull in a china closet. I grew up on farms. I was hardworking. I didn't mind sleeping in less than fancy circumstances and so forth.
Ike had some rough years in his Wyoming hometown as he went from childhood to adolescence, but during high school, he moved to Tooele, Utah. At that time, Tooele, located about 40 miles southwest of Salt Lake City, was a very blue-collar town. Ike started having a much better experience in school and socially. More importantly, it was there that he started dating a girl, and she and her family encouraged him to attend church. Ike's parents were members of the church, but had never been active. In Tooele, he became an active member, and later served a mission. When he came home, he married his high school sweetheart, whose family had been so supportive and influential. He also attended college and then graduate school at Ohio State University. It was here that he unknowingly took the next small step toward what would become his path in life.
I think it was the October 1971 General Conference Priesthood session, which I went to a stake center to listen to. I was surprised to hear James O. Mason give a talk, which I later found out was almost just off the cuff, because he'd only been asked to give that talk the morning of that evening. The purpose of the talk was to explain and announce that the church was moving forward in what they were then calling a health missionary movement around the world. And he and President Lee had originally talked about this while he was Commissioner of Health for the church and ran the church hospital system. And when I heard that talk, I just had this interesting, deep sense of feeling about what a wonderful thing this is.
The church had recently organized a new church health services department, and James Mason was asked to lead it. The church was increasingly interested and concerned about the health and well-being of missionaries, members, and others in communities around the world. Specially called health missionaries, they reasoned, would be one way of educating and inspiring others. Ike's interest in the new health missionary work fed closely into his studies. He was studying public health, So the 16 church-operated hospitals in the western US aligned with his studies. But graduate school was difficult, especially while raising 3 children, one of whom had a chronic illness. Ike eventually graduated with a PhD in preventative medicine and public health, and in 1974, he and his family moved to southern Illinois with the intent to be a professor. But the Fergusons had only been there for a few months before Ike received a call from James Mason himself to work instead as a manager of health services. Ike had never anticipated working for the church and was stunned at the opportunity offered him.
It was just an amazing series of things that happened, which in retrospect, I feel like weren't random. The Lord had kind of put me in place. And keep in mind, I was a little kid from Wyoming that had no church background at all growing up. My parents were inactive. And all of a sudden, here I am being asked to be part of this amazing thing.
Although the job was unexpected, Ike had been involved in the church's humanitarian work before. In 1968, he helped distribute funds raised by church members to help people in Africa suffering from famine, an experience that required identifying new partnerships and ways of working to give help effectively. He enjoyed his work helping to manage the Worldwide Health Missionary Program, but after a few years, Dr. Mason retired, and a number of other changes followed. Eventually, Ike was reassigned to be an area welfare manager in Indiana to help expand welfare services throughout North America.
And I was thinking, why are they doing this to me? I came here to do international health work, and now I'm a general administrator doing grain and storehouses and social services and all these other things. But then after 5 years there, Bishop Glenn Pace, who was a new member of the bishopric, called me on the phone and said, we'd like you to come back and take this humanitarian assignment.
In 1985, Ike had heard much about the famine in Eastern Africa. Dry conditions and a civil war in Ethiopia, a poor, arid country with an extensive desert terrain, had resulted in a major humanitarian disaster. Later, President Monson told Ike it was seeing the emaciated people and hearing about how many people were starving to death that prompted him to think of ways the church could help. That same year, the church asked its members in North America to participate in 2 special fasts, the funds from which would be donated to humanitarian relief efforts for those suffering in Africa.
When they gave me the assignment and asked me to come back from Indiana to spend this humanitarian money, the basic message was, we're giving you an office. You're sort of by yourself. Do it. When the money is spent, we'll send you back. These 2 special fasts, they'd gathered about $11 or $12 million, and they didn't have any idea how to spend it. They selected me, I think, because I had spent 5 or 6 years as the director of the Thresher Research Fund, where we were giving grants, and I was working all over the world in many of the places where the church didn't exist, like India, for example, and Nepal and China, a whole bunch of different places where we had research projects for Thrasher, but there was no church presence. Bishop Pace and a couple of others, Elder Ballard, had gone out and they'd given large amounts of money out, generally with no guidelines, no parameters for how to spend the money, just do good with it. And they gave it to these big agencies to take care of it. And it became pretty evident that we needed more structure. We needed some set of guidelines and procedures about how to do things and how we decide to make contributions to different efforts and so on. So there were a lot of things rambling around in those early days, which were very interesting. But it all fell together in pieces in my mind over those first few years.
With the money from the fasts, the church had partnered with a non-government agency called Africare to develop a water system in a large agricultural area that got its water from mountain snow, but had no way of storing the water should the stream dry up midway through the season. That partnership resulted in a weir, a structure that fed water into a series of canals around the land. The church partnered with the Red Cross to send trucks filled with food to Ethiopia.
In 1986, Ike was asked to help spend the remaining funds and to ensure that the church was able to do the most good possible. Although some arrangements had been made before he started, his experience helped him know how to unravel snags in those respective plans and how else the affected countries might be best helped with the resources available. The church had no infrastructure in Ethiopia, so leaders decided to give funds to other well-run and ethical charitable organizations working on the ground to help those in need. Altogether, the fasts and the efforts to help those African countries in dire need seemed to have been a job well done, and maybe the start of something new. Historically, the church as an organization hadn't been formally involved in humanitarian work with partnerships with other organizations. Instead, members had been encouraged to donate to respectable charities that did good around the world. The experience with Ethiopia and the other struggling countries, and the obvious dedication members had to helping them, prompted church leaders to think about ways the church could be more directly and officially involved in this type of work.
In 1985, not long before Ike was brought on to help distribute to the African nations, the church organized area presidencies to better help lead and serve the needs of areas around the world. Closer proximity to the saints helped the area presidencies know how to better serve members and non-members alike, and especially during times of trouble and disaster. Top leaders of the church were concerned with how to extend Christ's commandment to love thy neighbor to neighbors everywhere. Ike's assignment was supposed to be temporary, but before long his efforts were expanded.
There was no welfare presence internationally at all, and no one to manage any humanitarian activities. The international organization was still really fledgling. Interesting, however, that both President Hinckley and President Monson, who were counselors in the first presidency and basically running the church because of the illness of the president during that time, they never wavered in feeling that this was a good thing to do. And they defended it time and time again. When President Hinckley became president himself, he seemed to have this assured sense that humanitarian service had a place in the future of the church. And of course, President Monson served as the chairman of the Welfare Services Executive Committee for many years. And it was that committee and his committee that I brought all the requests for humanitarian projects. I did that for 12 years, every month. Every single project that humanitarian service did was funneled through that Welfare Service Executive Committee. But what they were doing, they were fleshing it out. They were trying to see what is good and what shouldn't we do and so forth. We learned a lot about what needed to happen.
With Ike's experience in the field came the unsettling knowledge of how quickly administrative costs could eat up a humanitarian organization's funding. Things like staffing, office space, and other costs of doing business could leave little left over for helping those in need. Even as he was urged to spend more money on humanitarian causes, Ike wrestled with how to prioritize the funding donated and allotted to those causes to do the most good possible.
We wanted to go to the programs. I wrestled with trying to decide how to spend more, but spend it well. And being alone, there was a limit to how many hours a day I could spend and how many weeks a year I could spend out of the office trying to get these things done. In the early days, it was me in an office and a computer. I had no staff. The first 4 years, I had 0 people to help. So that initial $12 million was up to me to go find good places to spend it. And so I was in Latin America, Central America, South America. I was in the South Pacific. I was in Africa. I was in Asia. I was just on the road. And my trips would usually end up being about 3 weeks and hitting 6 or 7 countries because there was so many things to do, so many things to get done. It was a real challenge. I feel like those early days were interesting and challenging, but super rewarding for me.
As the church continued to become more international, there became more opportunities and difficulties for conducting humanitarian work. Having area presidencies meant having more leadership in more places of the world, but those positions changed hands every 3 years. Mission presidents, also local authorities on the needs of saints and their neighbors in any given part of the world, were also swapped out every 3 years. Even the leadership over humanitarian efforts closer to home seemed to change quickly. Having boots on the ground, so to speak, could help Ike and the church understand local needs, but so much turnover meant Ike was constantly in a state of getting to know you with new leaders.
Because Ike had to think on a global scale, there were always many different problems to think about. No two countries had exactly the same challenges or needs. The church was typically quiet about its humanitarian efforts as well, and let the work get done without accolades. However, from working with the different area authorities and mission presidents, it became clear that the governments in some countries didn't see the value of allowing the church to operate within their borders, or were generally unfriendly to missionary efforts. Being more overt about humanitarian efforts in those countries could help.
Within a year or two, I was having area presidencies all the time come to me and say, "So how much have we done in Nicaragua? How much have we done in Samoa?" They wanted to go back to the government leaders and use that as influencing the decisions that were being made about the church in many places. So it didn't take long for the priesthood side to start wanting to use the humanitarian cause as a validation of our goodness and our willingness to serve and bless the people. But it took a while for it to all cement itself in.
Operating in every corner of the world, though, took more than just hearing of a need and showing up. Different countries had different requirements of how international organizations could legally operate within their borders. And within those borders were different cultures that had to be respected and worked with, not steamrolled over. Sometimes, too, there were existing organizations that could be partnered with to help humanitarian efforts go farther. Ike had to consider how best to work within each country and consult with local leaders, members, and other organizations. Some countries were easier to get into than others.
Belarus was one of those hard nuts to crack. I'll remember going there 2 or 3 times just to explore possibilities. In order to do work in Belarus, we had to be registered as a nonprofit. And so I convinced the brethren. My recommendation was that they create a legal nonprofit so that we could operate as a humanitarian entity and we could bring things in and so on. We did a number of things to get things rolling. We did a lot of work with compromised populations like nursing homes and care for the elderly. We did a lot for victims of the nuclear disaster next door. We did a lot of work over on that part of the country where the Chernobyl accident occurred because cancer was high.
Although much of Ike's work has been centered on how to help as many people as possible with the available resources, he has found great reward in connecting with individuals. And he knows how blessed he was to be able to focus so intently on helping people, rather than some of the more earthly concerns that some other organizations had to consider. Because of the church's secure financial structure, he had to worry less about keeping the lights on than he might have in other circumstances. It allowed him to look at his role less as a job and more like a calling.
I remember sitting in a car with 2 guys from CARE International years ago. It was while we were involved with Ethiopia, and we were out in the desert. And I was in the back seat, and the 2 colleagues were up front in the car. And I kind of dozed off a little bit and was quiet. And I could hear these 2 guys talking up front. And what they were talking about was, how are we going to get our next grant so that we can keep our jobs? We love what we're doing here, and we want to find money so that we can keep it going, but we need our job. It was employment to them. And I think that's somewhat of a difference, that most of the people who work in our effort do it for the love of it. Someone said that you never work a day in your life if you love what you do. That's almost my motto. I've never worried about how much time it took or how long it took.
Today, Ike is enjoying retirement. Not that a guy like him can ever really relax. For the last 15 years, he has been a church service missionary, and his wife served alongside him until 2019, when health challenges forced her to take a quieter retirement. Ike is still involved in welfare and has been helping establish an organization that supports and promotes welfare and humanitarian service in areas throughout the world. Ike is also heartened by some of the minor changes that have come about, including the church being more open about the help that it gives, rather than hiding that particular light under a bushel. And as he sees the work he helped build continue, he remembers those early days and how the seed he and others planted has flourished in the decades since.
I remember sitting in a meeting in Bishop Robert D. Hale's office, 1987, when he was a presiding bishop. We were having the discussion. It was a managing director of welfare, myself, and all the bishopric. It was a round circle. We had coats off and sleeves rolled up. It was one of those working sessions. And the question was, how are we going to make this humanitarian thing work organizationally in the church? How are we going to bring it about? And we went back and forth for quite a while. And then I remember Bishop Hales said to me something I've never forgotten. Ike, we need to think about how humanitarian service is going to operate in a 50 million member church. That really struck me. We've got to think about this in a way that can be managed. And what that amounted to is somehow it's got to be moved out to the field so that it can be managed from the field. Well, just last year, Elder Ballard sent out a letter indicating that the primary responsibility for welfare and humanitarian activities are going to shift from headquarters to areas. All of a sudden, I'm thinking, whoa, that vision of Bishop Hales was pretty amazing, wasn't it? But it took us from 87 to 23. It took us 40 years to get to this point. But it's coming. And it all had to do with a maturing international organization with well-established area presidencies and staffs to handle these things.
As different responsibilities such as humanitarian work continue to be decentralized from church headquarters to the areas, there are more and more opportunities for local skills, experience, and cultural awareness to increase the church's reach to help others and make meaningful contributions. It has come a long way from just Ike working from an office in Salt Lake City in the late 1980s. Ike's efforts stand as a reminder for us all that as Latter-day Saints we are called to be instruments in the hands of God, in relieving suffering and making the world a better place. Ike's work in Africa was the start of the Humanitarian Services Department and what would come to be known as Latter-day Saint Charities, a charitable organization working to coordinate the work and donations of Latter-day Saints with other reputable relief organizations. Many hands make light work, as the saying goes, and helping build an organization that supports those helping hands has blessed the lives of millions around the globe.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Saints Volume 4, the podcast. We hope you come away with new insights, perspective, and appreciation for the history of the church. If you'd like to share those thoughts, we'd love to hear from you at saintspodcast@churchofjesuschrist.org.